two things did, which are kind of separate. But the first thing was I was reading the Miami Herald, and way back in the last couple pages of Section A, there was about a 3-inch article that I barely remember. All I remember was that the scientists were claiming that the fishermen were overfishing something. And the fishermen were saying, there is no way to ever harm the population of this creature because there are so many. And I became obsessed with the fact that I had heard that before. And so I started looking into it, and it turns out, of course, it's a very common thing that that's what they said about the passenger pigeon 105 years ago. And well, a little bit more than 105, because they were saying it in the mid-1800s, and by 1914, the last passenger pigeon died. I created a pretty substantial piece, an installation of passenger pigeons, trying to evoke the idea that they had violent death and unnecessary death, that it was remains. I didn't want them to be pretty birds. And so there was a very rough technique of making them. In the process of researching them, though, I went up to the Field Museum in Chicago, and there had been a delay of me getting to the museum for my appointment to get to see the bird collection, because a presidential thing was coming through Chicago, and I was really not happy about that. But once I got in there, okay, I have access to a few passenger pigeons that I could actually touch and draw and record. And then all of a sudden, the person who was kind of like my keeper, because I couldn't just have free reign in the collection, said, you have to finish up now. I have to go and count the birds under the buildings. And I was like, what in the world are you speaking of? And it was the collisions, the bird collisions during migratory season. I was obsessed with that. So the whole plane ride home, I just knew that as soon as I hit Miami, something about this bird collision, of which I did tons of research. It was one of those things where the biggest problem is it was not really known back, nobody knew. I talked to architects and said, what about bird-friendly architecture? They said, what are you talking about? And for more than 5 years, I was obsessive on all sorts of art, sculpture, photography, drawings, anything about the bird collisions and their impact on populations of birds. That was about a 5-year stint, which was kind of humorous, because by the end, people just called me bird-brained and everything. I mean, everything was about birds. Kind of a parallel story is that this kind of feeds the mythic stories to my experience, which is if I saw, let's say, one day I found a little dead snake. It was obviously a baby snake that had been killed in one, let's say, foot stomp. And I momentarily mourned this snake and decided that I was interested in those things that were overlooked and forgotten, but that I would want to make known. So I actually collected up that paper-thin baby dead snake, put it into art. And so it was more like this interest in the individual, the pieces, evidence that led to the bigger and bigger picture of being interested. In this particular exhibit that I'm sitting in, a lot of this is not the same as other environmental artists who are approaching art, because I'm very interested in the thing that nobody's talking about. For instance, in multiple pieces speaks of sand mining and the fact that we're hardening our coast, making the concrete out of the same sand that we're mining, and it's just this constant thing. There's actually sand pirates in the world. And so those are the types of things that fascinate me, the things I would have never thought of. And so once I hear a little piece of it, I heard of a book where the geologist was speaking of the origins of the Earth in terms of color, and I decided to read his whole book to create the color Earths, because I thought I love that idea that something not in the realm of art, is using the terms that I associate with art. So like the extinction of color piece, and other times where there's either an absurdity involved, there is a contradiction involved, it's overlooked. Like, still there are people who don't realize how serious the bird collisions are. I think there are estimates of up to something like 500 million. When I started researching, it was 100 million birds were being killed a year. Now they think it's about 500 million birds per year killed in the United States. So some of it's getting critical. Anybody who's paying attention to what's happening in the environment, you know, the populations of insects, the populations of these songbirds that migrate, how much sand we have, our water levels, our water quality. It's all coming to a critical point in a sudden fashion. Some of my other work, this is kind of embedded in all of it, but the Suburban Ledgers talks about how I think that there's a danger in a couple of concepts, one of which is artists talking to artists. I think artists even talking to scientists, which I do, and still kind of talking to our own family. We're keeping it in the family. And so I'm not saying I've solved this problem, but I feel an urgency that art has to take a responsibility, art that is speaking of something important, to jump the fence and speak to those that would not normally, let's say, have exposure to it. And like I said, I haven't solved the problem, but one of the things I did was I went from being an artist whose colors were very muted or non-existent, which has to do with my origin story. I was born in Connecticut, lived my first 5.5 years there, came to Florida. I was raised in Perrine, and if anybody doesn't know Perrine, it's, you know, part of Miami, but it's certainly a different existence. It's not like growing up in the Grove. It's not like growing up on Miami Beach. It's not even like growing up in Homestead. Perrine is kind of like the space between the other. It's a kind of a lost space. And my childhood was also unusual in the fact that my parents kept us very contained. We did not have a worldly experience. We had a very contained experience, which again fed the mythology and the interest in the environment, in that the most delightful moments of my childhood were laying in the backyard watching what things came to the flowering tree of my next door neighbor, of which was a huge myriad of pollinators. And I would lay there fascinated for hours. And also the nature treated me as though I was part of them because I would be so quiet in watching it. So these are the things that fed it. But also Perrine is an economically distressed area, particularly the side of the highway I lived on. So growing up through civil rights era, Vietnam War era, there was some hardships. You know, a lot of the Vietnam drafts came from my neighborhood, not other neighborhoods. That was the older brothers and sisters of my generation. And the civil rights caused rioting, also, you know, changes of schools and things that for me were positive, but still was a character forming event. So that plays out in this Suburban Ledger, where you cannot separate the politics, the society, even the religions that are all clashing when speaking of the environment and what are we going to do about it. So this is what's playing out in my head.